Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we react the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my evolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers, he is an author, a columnist and political commentator, life member of the Socialist Council of Ents, Comrade Chris Trotter. And he is the political columnist for the NBR, political consultant, commentator, and moral shepherd of the right, Matthew Hooton. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, David Shearer's first big redirection speech for Labour. Has he done enough? Has he done too little? Will Shearer still be Labour Party leader in 2014? Issue 2, John Key's big speech is also released today. With a backdown over MFAT, can the public services hope protests will fend Key off? And is there a looming clash between Joyce and English? Issue 3, the Ports of Auckland dispute exploded this week with Willie Jackson calling for violence and that awful Cameron Slater publishing the private personal details of a wharfie on his blog. Beyond the smoke and mirrors, is this manufactured crisis really about privatising the ports? And we'll end the show on a final word. But let's kick things off with issue 1. Today, David Shearer's leadership of Labour has been so laid back, it's almost been in a coma. Today's speech was a carefully crafted event aimed at reorientating the Labour Party post its disastrous 27% showing at last year's election. Chris, the fear has been that Shearer owes his leadership to the right of the party, and based on today's speech, which did have some harder welfare Pagani dog whistles, is that fear baseless?
Well, I think David Shearer is very much in the mould of David Lange. In fact, I think both of those politicians' personal histories have quite a bit in common. And I think the worrying thing from the perspective of certainly the Labour left will be that, like Lange, David Shearer regards economics in the way you and I regard an electrician. You know, if the lights stop working, you call in an electrician and he fixes them. If the economy stops working, you call in the economists, the experts, the technocrats. They'll tell you what to do, you do it, and everything will be hunky-dory. Now,
Right.
you know, New Zealand discovered to its cost that the people who touted themselves as experts in the 80s and 90s were anything but. And Labour, you know, finally managed to get itself on more or less an even keel from 1999 to 2008. And I suspect that what Shearer thinks is, well, I know I'm going to be like this fellow Asko, or whatever his name is, from Finland. I'm going to come in and I'm going to do what needs to be done, and if that costs me the next election, well,
So be
heck,
it.
so be it. Well, I mean, I checked out the GDP of Finland going all the way back to the 80s, right up to 2000. And actually, GDP under this Conservative chappie fell.
Right.
And he was voted out largely because he slashed and burned in the social services area. So if this is the
benchmark,
if this is the model that our friend David is looking at, I'm becoming just, you know, ever so slightly alarmed.
What were you impressed? What were you not impressed with the speech?
Oh God, I just wish there was someone in the Labour Party like, you know, Toby Ziegler or Sam Seaborn, someone who could come up with just one line that was memorable in a speech. Because I don't think David's quite capable of doing it. I mean, I suppose to be fair, we've got to give Connor Roberts his due, because he came up with the one about, you know, Key made 50 million and Shearer saved
But what's
50
Connor
million.
done for us recently?
Well,
Really?
well, that's another subject just coming up. But, you know, I waited for something memorable. Now, you know, the Labour Party is spinning like crazy saying this was a masterful piece of work. Everyone's breathing a huge sigh of relief. Yeah, but they're not jumping to their feet and whooping either. You know? And frankly, if every time your leader speaks, you breathe a huge sigh of relief because he didn't stuff it up, that's not really a ringing endorsement either.
Matthew, Shearer's speech talked a lot about vision, and he has managed to highlight that sense that governments don't tend to see through difficult policy, meaning the problems never get fixed. How inspirational, though, do you think is outsider political cynicism? Because that's what he's trying to channel here.
Well, I think that he contrasts himself quite well with the Prime Minister, who, you know, is so deeply pragmatic that it's difficult to think of anything he wouldn't do to get a third term. And we'll talk about that later on, I'm sure, in the student loans context. So what he's saying is, I'm someone who does care about you, does care about the country rather than my own CV. And that's how he's trying to contrast himself with John Key.
Right.
And You know, he already won the battle of the two speeches when the Dominion Post this morning put his picture, exactly the same size, alongside John Key's on their front
Right.
page. Now, when John Key finally beat Helen Clark, and Chris picked this up sooner than most people, was when Helen Clark allowed John Key to be her equal over the anti-smacking legislation.
Yes,
They had the
yes,
press conference where
yes.
they both stood as equals with the New Zealand flags behind them. And Helen Clark probably thought she was being really smart. She probably thought, look, 90% of the population opposed this legislation, and I'm going to get that prick Key to, that rich prick Key,
Yes, the rich prick, yes.
to stand beside me and support it, and
Yeah.
that will mean 90% of the population will hate him as well as me. Well, it didn't work for her because for some reason they kept on hating him, and everyone who cared about that issue being against the legislation forgave Key.
Yeah.
But from that moment, he was her equal. And as soon as the leader of the opposition is the Prime Minister's equal, the Prime Minister's dead.
He looks. So you think that Shearer's come out of this looking like the next Prime Minister?
Well, look, I can't see that the media is going to argue that John Key gave a significantly better speech than David
Right.
Shearer. And of course, if you're the Prime Minister, you have to give a better speech than the Leader of the Opposition when it comes to substantial policy, because you've got, as we know only too well, 35,000 Wellington policy analysts there
Yeah.
to advise you on policy
Sure.
initiatives. And if you can't come up with any policy,
Yeah.
and the Leader of the Opposition, you know, kind of does, by
Yeah,
confirming the
Yeah.
capital gains tax initiative and some other things on welfare. And for a Labor government, I thought it was fantastic. A Labor opposition saying, we believe in excellence in education. That was a big step
And
forward.
a slight little boot in the rear end of teachers.
Yes, wasn't
Yeah.
that interesting? That was very interesting.
You know,
wasn't it?
I mean, the more I think about this and listening just now to Matthew, the more I think that parallel with Longy holds.
Right.
If you go back to Muldoon, I mean, you know, allowing for all the differences, obviously there are a multitude of differences, but essentially the situation in New Zealand boiled down to this. You had a Prime Minister who refused to address the big issues.
Yeah, yeah.
While Labor was led by someone who was going to take a radically different approach to solving the big issues, one which would not necessarily sit too well with business,
Yeah.
Muldoon was safe. But as soon as it became clear that there was a Labor Party that was led by someone who was keen to make a difference, who wasn't afraid of losing next time,
Yeah.
and who had behind him, you know, a number of people who would do some of the things that needed to be done in New Zealand, then suddenly it was Sir Rob who?
What in terms of David's speech? What's Waitakere Man thinking? How's he going to look at this?
Oh, well, you know, the sly little digs at the teachers, the idea that he wants to create a New Zealand in which everyone can get ahead. Well, that's an interesting phrase, get ahead.
Yeah.
That's a direct appeal to Waitakere Man. Waitakere Man sees the world very clearly. There are winners, there are losers. Waitakere Man and his wife do not want to be counted among the losers.
Yep.
So if Labor is going to get Waitakere Man back, he has to be convinced that he can be a winner. And
Matthew-
Labor can help him be a winner.
Should the Greens be worried here? Shearer mentioned the environment as much as he mentioned education in his speech. What percentage do you think Labor see the Greens at in 2014?
The Green Party is no longer about the environment primarily. It's about radical Marxism, and that's what its leadership is. I mean,
Oh,
Say
God, I
it
wish.
it has
I
two.
wish.
It has two. It
I
has.
wish,
It's
exactly.
got one leader, the former communist Australian.
Yes, yes.
And it's got
And an
this
anarchist.
bizarre anarchist who
Yeah.
up in Waitangi was saying that life is like being in a cage with the capitalists scratching at the edges of the cage. I mean,
Actually, I thought she was channeling Plato at that.
well, anyway, look, if you are a left-wing person,
Yep.
you're not going to be comfortable with the Shearer Labor Party over time,
Yep,
because it is
yep.
going to go to the centre. It is going to go for Waitakere Man, and that's by far the best strategy, and any game theorist will tell you
Yep,
that.
yep.
And the Greens, I think, have a remarkable opportunity to pick up more votes on the left. But
Okay.
they can't really claim to be an environmentalist party in the sense that they just follow whatever the latest sort of fad is. I mean, they campaigned against genetic modification. It's whatever is scary.
Engineering,
Um,
actually.
Yeah, well, it's funny, we're still waiting for the health hazards to come through, given
They'll
it's
happen,
been
they'll
in
happen.
30,
Rate,
40
let's,
years.
question to both of you. Let's rate Shearer's speech out of 10 and why. What would you give him out of 10?
Well, it's a 7 because he's the leader of the opposition, and it gave some direction about his party, and it got a headline over the capital gains tax. And of course, the capital gains tax policy is something which is so obvious that New Zealand should have that no serious business person would ever disagree with it.
Right, out of 10?
Oh, I wouldn't be quite as generous as Matthew. I'd give it a 6. As I say, it has no ringing phrases, nothing to hang your hat on. I mean, there's nothing in the Longy sense of, you can't run the country like a Polish shipyard. I mean, when Labour can start coming up with phrases like that, then it really is all going to be on.
Well, with the new super ministry, that's going to control. This is incredible. This is from a national government.
Well, we're getting into that in a second.
I mean,
Hold on.
It would be a line that would be just as appropriate today.
That super minister, that's right. Thank you, panel. Moving on to issue 2. When John Key said he was going to cap the public service, he meant kneecap. The right wing's favourite government with a microscopic G meme is an easy sell in a recession. But is austerity the answer? Chris, Key's promise not to slash and burn public services has been shown up as a bit of a fib, with thousands of jobs already gone and thousands more to go in the future. What was the intent and purpose of today's speech?
Well, I mean, what he's proposing, particularly in relation to this super ministry, presumably led by his good friend Mr. Joyce, seems to me to be almost on a par with what Jim Anderton tried to do. In 1999.
But more left wing.
Because what Jim Anderton wanted to do is when he wanted to set up a ministry that could actually fight Treasury on equal terms.
Right.
And it seems to me that those who watch these sort of internal wranglings closely would be wondering, just how much faith the Prime Minister still reposes in his Finance Minister. Because Mr. Joyce is sort of like, Finance Minister 2.0, isn't he, really?
Look, it is like something out, quite literally, out of Eastern Europe in the 1970s. What you've got here is a government announcing these targets. That's like a 5-year plan. There will be this much steel production.
Coal.
And except this is done in a social policy context, but it's all central planning, central targets. You will meet them, and then they're setting up this super ministry that is going to control everything, from economic development and subsidy programs, business regulation, immigration, allocating tertiary education resources, industry training,
labour,
immigration, labour regulations. I mean, what can only, unless I've got this completely wrong and there's something in the detail, what it sounds like is we're going to be saying, we need more engineers in New Zealand, so we're going to have some more immigrants with engineering qualifications this year, and we're going to expand the Auckland University Engineering School. But we've done some analysis that says we don't need so many architects, so we're going to cut that back. And the idea that a guy who was a relatively successful businessman in the context of New Plymouth,
moderately successful.
I mean, not. He set up some radio stations and sold them for a profit. The idea that he has insights into the future of the New Zealand economy that beat the market, which are better than the combined wisdom of every business person in New Zealand, is simply ridiculous. He is going on a road show to listen to and advise businesses about removing roadblocks. I mean, this is something that we haven't seen in New Zealand since Kirkle Rolling. This is not back to Muldoonism. It is before that.
Hold on. Key's 10 points for New Zealand follows Stephen Joyce's 6 key areas for business growth, which was released on Monday, which is a subset of the 4 main priorities Key outlined at the beginning of the year, but weren't the same 4 priorities outlined by the 6-point economic plan rolled out in 2010, which were different again from the 6 points of broader focus off the National Party campaign billboards, and which have little to do with the 120-point economic action plan announced at last year's election. This sounds like a lot of action plans with no actual action.
It is provincial accountants. It is simply writing of lists, checking boxes, and what is deeply disappointing is that John Key was elected with a license to be creative. There were people in New Zealand from across the political spectrum who really did think that because of his international experience and because of his wealth and the insights he must have had into the global economy to make that wealth, that he would be transformational, and he used to give speeches about Lee Kuan Yew,
That's right,
about
that's right.
Singapore,
Yep.
and instead we're getting, as you've appropriately lampooned, just random lists that differ from speech to speech, and now a Soviet-style approach
And this
to
is the point.
industrial
This is the point. This is
policy.
the cue which I think many people missed. Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew pioneered the style of economic management which is now playing out in China. I mean, it was a kind of Chinese outpost, and the Chinese on the mainland looked very closely at what Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew did and have followed it. This is the authoritarian capitalism which is powering ahead of the Anglo neoliberal model, and it would be ironic to beat the band if we really have, as Matthew suggests, come full circle.
Yes.
And that instead of opening up to the market, we're seeing a competition between National and Labour as to who can reimpose state control with the least
We are
fuss.
seeing a full circle, because the other thing I forgot in the list, they're bringing in the Crown Research Institutes
That's
into
right.
this new super ministry under Stephen Joyce's control, because of course he must be a
The
scientist as
Oracle.
well.
Yes.
And, you know, they were all devolved over the last 20 years. There were
right.
reasons. Oh, New
Yes.
Zealand Trade and
That's
Enterprise
right,
that
that's right.
represents the government internationally, in not in the capital cities, but in the commercial
Yep.
capitals around the world, and promotes New Zealand exports. They're coming into the super
Yes.
ministry. We used to have this when we had a state-run Norman Kirk, Wallace Rolling economy.
Only in Big Norman dreams.
The question to you both. The question to you both.
I mean,
the
this
question
is
to you both.
this is the most left-wing industrial policy in my
Yes.
lifetime by far.
With the restructuring of super ministries under Joyce, when will Bill and Stephen go to war?
Well,
when is it happening now?
Well, I can't. It is happening. There is incredible tension between the two, I'm told. Now, in the 90s, when I was working in the government, we all looked at Bill English as this hopeless wet, right? Now, I don't think he's changed, but it says something about the drift to the left under John Key in the last couple of years, that Bill English is now seen as the radical reformer who has to be held back.
Right.
Surely
know-
it will be a battle, not necessarily of the ministers, although, for the public it will play out as a tension between Joyce and English. But what the insiders in Wellington are likely to witness is extraordinary bloodshed in the corridors of power.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Joyce will win.
As
It's not a-
as Treasury's boffins, make a last-ditch stand against Joyce's hordes,
Right.
of hands-on,
But there are
tick
dangers.
the boxes bureaucrats.
There are significant dangers, obviously, in terms of economic progress, because for the life of me, I can't think of anywhere in the world this particular Norman Kirk Wallace Rolling
Cuba,
model.
it's doing
is-
wonderful. Cuba, it's doing wonderful.
We're
in Cuba.
brilliantly in Gdansk
Yeah, yeah,
and Poland and so forth. But there's political
Shall we
risks.
call it the Gdansk strategy, shall we?
There's some political risks associated with this as well that I'm not sure have been thought through. And that is that it leads to a very slippery slope towards crony capitalism and corruption. And we've seen those deals which were entirely legitimate and lawful and arguably justifiable with MediaWorks, with Warner Brothers,
Yep.
and with Sky City. Now, they were the beginning, and I believe they were
It
okay.
can't work any other way.
But once you start going
Yeah.
down this path of having cabinet ministers and their super ministries making decisions about, well, that business should get that particular privilege and this one should get that indulgence,
yeah.
you're on your way
Yeah.
to a very bad place, and it didn't work in Eastern Europe,
And
so
it-
it's surprising that the
didn't
National
work
Party...
for Jim Anderton either.
No, well, no.
Because he identified shipbuilding and a number
Yep.
of things, and none of them in the end
That's
really
right. That's
worked.
right. Who won Super Thursday, Shearer or Key?
Oh well, I suppose Shearer can claim a win here, if only because the message he gave out was simpler than this. Yeah, well, you lampooned it beautifully. I mean, people are going to struggle to cope with Prime Minister Key's speech today, I think.
Who won?
Well, you'd say in terms of likelihood of winning the next election, Shearer won
Yep.
today. But you'd have to say the big winner is the far political left and Jim Andertonism. because they've captured
Fidel Castro.
they've finally captured John Key. You know?
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. The Ports of Auckland dispute exploded this week with Willie Jackson calling for violence and that awful Cameron Slater publishing the private personal details of a wharfie on his blog. Beyond the smoke and mirrors, however, is this manufactured crisis really about privatising the ports? Chris, Hutchinson Port Holdings Trust are the ones who have prepared the report for the port's restructuring, union crushing and profit maximisation agenda, and Hutchinson Port Holdings Trust is very much in the business of privatising ports. Seeing as Ports of Auckland current chairman Richard Pearson was formerly employed by the Hutchinson Port Holdings Trust, should Auckland ratepayers be concerned that this entire fiasco is to generate the justifications for the privatisation of the port?
Well, there are some interesting questions which have emerged this week. You've alluded to the release of the private information of one of the striking workers, but also there's the delay, I think, is probably the kindest word we can use, in the announcement of the third stevedoring company. And there is a rising level of speculation that this third company may, in fact, be the creature of somebody who was involved in the negotiations, which really recalls the Diagnostic Med Lab, whatever, stoush, of a few years ago, and
All my old battles.
I can only see this falling further and further into the lap of lawyers, because if it turns out that someone who was engaged on the employer's side in the negotiations
Was aware of
suddenly turns up, bidding for one of the contracts.
That's outrageous.
I mean, people are just going to be even more agitated.
I've just got to mention, though, the Hutchinson Port Holdings. I've worked for them in China. I've probably done about 3 months' work for them in total, in Hong Kong and also Shenzhen, Yantian. And, they are the best port company in the world. And Richard Pearson is the top port executive in the world. He was the guy that found this small fishing village in Yantian that even in the late 70s, in their boardroom they have pictures of the late 70s and everyone's wearing dunce caps and going around on donkeys, right? It's now, he then found that, he built that port. It is now the biggest port in the world. In practice it's co-managed with the Chinese government because that's how China works. So what you've got here is probably the most sophisticated port manager in the world, now as chairman of this port, and I would be a bit worried if I was the Maritime Union because they're up against the big guns. You've got, they're not playing games with Neville, Darrow and the Northern Club anymore.
I think that's very
But
clear.
in terms of privatisation, I think that's just an absolute red herring. I don't think this has anything to do whatsoever with the privatisation of these companies.
No attempt to hock off the assets?
Well, I think there is an ongoing issue which I feel very passionately about, that port shouldn't be where it is, that having a port smack bang in the middle of the CBD is ridiculous. I mean, the port, as Professor Tim Hazeldine from Auckland University has shown, doesn't make any money. It loses money once you take into account the value of the land. The value of the land is not accurately recorded in the company's balance sheet.
So plenty of reasons to privatise then.
Well, no. What you've got is just an asset that is no longer viable, and it's got nothing. It's not the workers' fault. It's not even the management's fault. It just doesn't make sense to have a port there. Now, it doesn't. It makes less than I think. I calculated at the very most it makes 1.3%.
It's never going to make 12%. It's never going to make 12%.
Well, it doesn't make 6. That's nonsense, and it'll never make 12. And what we really need to do is look at, and the Auckland Council, to their credit, is initiating this, and it's a once in a century opportunity to have a serious discussion, led by the Auckland Council, ironically, about the top of the North Island and how the ports should all interact with one another, because it doesn't make sense. They are competing with one another madly. Their balance sheets are not sensible or rational. They're not accurately recording. And it's actually, the person responsible is actually Mike Lee, because what he did, I'll explain.
I want to hear this.
He was the one who stopped the merger between Auckland and Tauranga. Now, Auckland and Tauranga, between them, own more than 50% of Northport. So if that merger between Auckland and Tauranga had happened, there would have been one company, majority owned by the people, by the people of Auckland, the people of Tauranga and the people of Northland, that have owned well over 50% of the shares. And you'd have been able to integrate those ports both in operational and pricing sense. And Mike Lee stopped it
Quick
for
question,
reasons
quick
I
question,
can't
final
comprehend.
question on this to both of you. Was Cam out of line for blogging on the personal tragedy of a Wharf at a point school with private information that it could only have come from the ports of Auckland? Was he out of line?
Absolutely.
Come
The
on.
person who's out of line is who, within the port or working for it, gave it to him. I mean, Cam is Cam.
Cam is
And he received this.
He
He's
will
an
do
out
what
there
Cam
blogger,
does.
Yeah.
he was never not going to publish it once he
No,
received it.
no.
I'm not even going to criticise him. That's the style of his blog. It's the person who gave him the information that
That's-
should be
that's-
fired.
Quite right.
Yeah.
Let's wrap the show with last word. Chris, your last word this week is?
Well, I'll just pick up on that whole issue of the release of that information. I think Matthew's quite right in relation to Cam. He is what he is.
Yeah.
There was the person who gave it to them. But more concerning to me were the news editors and the journalists who received it and used it and in many cases actually endorsed Cam's actions.
Yes, that was pretty sick.
Now,
wasn't it?
you know, either journalism has a code of ethics or it doesn't.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, then they can hardly complain if society creates a powerful regulatory body
Absolutely.
to step in and actually tell them what is ethical and what
Yeah.
is not. They really need to watch themselves
Yeah.
because that is what will happen
Yeah.
if there is any more of this.
Yeah.
You know, Cam can do what Cam does,
Yeah.
but that's no excuse
Absolutely.
for allowing the port's cynical release of private information to then be just broadcast by mainstream media, thanks to the the linkage provided by a right-wing blog.
Yeah. Good point. Matt, your final word?
Well, I'm a bit down on the Prime Minister this week.
You are?
And the reason
We're loving it.
the reason for that was his comments at a breakfast with Colliers International this week about the student loan scheme, and the context in the context of an $11 billion fiscal deficit. And he was asked what he thought about inflation adjusting the student loans of graduates, which would raise about $325 million a year for the government and do far more than, say, cutting the police by $46 million, which the Treasury is considering doing. Now, what the Prime Minister said was, look, the interest-free student loans are a tragedy. They cause students to borrow more than they should. They are very bad economics, but they're great politics, so I'm going to stick with them. Now, you know, it's like, Bismarck was wrongly attributed of saying that, you know, democracy or lawmaking is like a sausage. It might taste good, but you don't want to know how it's made, what's in it. Well, the Prime Minister might well be that cynical, but to actually express it on a stage to an audience of more than 500 people, I think was profoundly shocking. And for the life of me, I mean, that policy is so stupid, interest-free student loans, that Michael Cullen, when Helen Clark imposed on it, Michael Cullen stopped campaigning in the 2005 election because he was so appalled by that policy. Because what it means is that people making fries at McDonald's are paying taxes to cut the real value of the student loans of orthopaedic surgeons.
That was Grant Robertson's greatest achievement.
I mean, you
Grant's
might
not
have thought the interest was too high, but for goodness sake, inflation in the last 12 months was 1.85%. There's no reason why graduates who are working should not have their loans inflation adjusted.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Matthew. Ladies and gentlemen, my final word. Today we got to see two visions put by our two main political leaders. Shearer's vision, while light on detail and dog whistly enough to arouse the right but not spook the left, at least articulated some insight to the frustrations we face as a country with a decade of timid growth and high unemployment looming. John Key's speech, on the other hand, consisted of a 10-point plan, which is a subset of the 4 main priorities alongside the 6 economic goal KPIs, and seemed more chairman of the Soviet production ministry than visionary thinker. I kept waiting for Key to declare that chocolate rations are to be lifted while our war with Eurasia continued. Last year saw the lowest voter turnout in 120 years. 1 million enrolled voters just didn't bother voting. Sadly, those million voters would find lean pickings for democratic engagement from the vision declared by either leader today. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.